For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sanel Dlamini, former rector and vice-chancellor at the University of the Free State, discusses his book titled As by Fire, The End of the South African University. Can you tell us what this book is about and who should be reading it?
Sure. So the book As by Fire is really an account of the student protest movement between 2015 and 16. So more or less those 2 years, and trying to understand, trying to make sense of what was really going on. That is beyond the headlines of burning buildings and protesting students and police on campus and all of that. What's really going on here, you know? And what does it mean for the future of South African universities? So that's why I wrote the book. It is a book that I, like many of my more recent books, I quite deliberately try to write without the jargon of academic, pretense and so on, so that a parent who worries about whether to send their kids to a South African university can enjoy reading it. A student concerned about, their own studies and financing and the future of funding can read it, so that university leaders and leaders in any sector can understand what it means to lead in a crisis, which is one of the big, sort of issues in the book and so on. So it's really a general interest book for those concerned with education in general in our country.
Can you briefly share the two main reasons why you decided to write this book?
So the first was, of course, my own concern about getting to grips with what was going on and so on and so forth, trying to understand it intellectually. So there's, me, the professor, trying to understand what's going on, and then also to address a gap in the literature on leadership. Most people who write about leadership write about it in the corporate sector, not in higher education, and those who write about it in higher education write about it in contexts where it's reasonably easy to manage one-off crises. But what do you do when you lead in a place or in institutions where the crisis goes on and on, month in, month out, year in, year out? And what does that mean for leadership? So those were sort of to the intellectual, but also the political, actually, and how those come together in higher education.
Can you also tell us about how you went about conducting the research with the 11 vice-chancellors?
Yeah.
And you were included in that as a rector at the time at the University
That's right. So what I wanted to do was give a perspective on the crisis from the point of view of vice-chancellors. Now, most of my recent books, I try to write from where I am, that is from where I lead, from where I teach, and so on. So Knowledge in the Blood, for example, is a book about me being a dean at the University of Pretoria to tell a bigger story. This book is about me being a vice-chancellor with colleagues and telling a bigger story about society and its education systems. So I invited all the vice-chancellors, to participate in these interviews. And eventually I nailed down 11 of them. I wish it were more, but I got 11 vice-chancellors. And they were very eager to talk, to a peer who was going through similar things. And so that trust relationship set up a wonderful set of interviews in which I could probe with them my own understanding of what's going on, but also test and expand my understanding as to what was happening in different universities. Because the thing about the student protest movement, it played out differently at WITS compared to UCT, very differently at Northwest compared to Rhodes. So it was important to give different understandings of what was going on. And you can only do that really from the office of the VC, because remember, the VC, unlike the student, has to satisfy many constituencies: prospective students, current students, parents, alumni, donors, faculty, staff, etc. And trying to manage all of those expectations is a fairly unique position to be in when you're trying to run a university.
You also mentioned that your sense of how to achieve South Africa's education goal was different from how the student viewed it. How would you describe the goals that needed to be achieved and the differences in tactics?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the goals, I was completely in agreement with the students, both on the issue of making our universities culturally more inclusive. That is, not demographically, because most of our universities, with one exception, are in fact quite inclusive in their demography. You know, Wits is a very good example. I mean, a decade or two ago it was really a white university, is now essentially a black university as far. But that, the demographics is one thing, the cultural inclusion, feeling that you're part of the place, seeing yourself in the symbols and the symbolism in the professoriate, in the, you know, curriculum. That obviously was a big issue at UCT. But secondly, also the issue of funding. You know, how do you provide enough money for poor students who have nothing? Not only to get money for tuition and accommodation, but for textbooks and food and travel and all of that stuff, without which you can't run a university, you can't stay in a university, you know. And all of that made sense to me, because I remember, as I've written about in another book, how the reason I dropped out of university wasn't that I didn't have a bursary. I had a bursary. It was that morning when my mother looked at me and she didn't have money for bus and train and taxi to get to, from, you know, Retreat in the southern suburbs to Bellville in the north side. That day I dropped out. It wasn't the big money, it was the little thing that broke the camel's back. So I understood where the students were coming from, you know, in terms of that, and I supported that very much. Where I lost, like many South Africans, lost my empathetic kind of attachment to the movement was when it turned very violent, very racist, very misogynistic. And I just said, this is not, you know, this is destroying what started off as a really, really important message, and distorted it by people who thought that you could build by breaking, you know, and for me that was a tragedy.
What interventions would have helped to better resolve the problems associated with the Fees Must Fall campaign?
None that university vice-chancellors could come up with, because to solve the problem of funding, you needed the government. You know, these are public universities. They're not, the private sector can't sustain with its funding the problem that needed to be resolved, you know. You needed the government to say that here is recurrent funding for what was by now a massive number of largely poor students in the system. We've never had so many poor students in the system, and the system wasn't responding to that, you know. And in my view, that inability to respond was a government problem, not a. Unfortunately, the students took it out largely on the universities, as if the vice-chancellors had their own stash of money somewhere. This was not true, of course. And I think the failure of government to understand in the early phases the seriousness of the problem, that put us all at risk.
Would you say that the Fees Must Fall campaign was the most challenging experience for you in your position as rector at the University of the Free State?
Not really. You know, I think where I worked at the University of the Free State, the really deep issue was dealing with racism. That was very, very deep in the institution, and you know, it was a place for almost 100 years was set up for and run by white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, in a place that's really isolated, in which relationships on the surrounding farms were still untransformed. You still had mainly white farmers, very conservative, sometimes deeply racist, and black laborers who weren't running their own farms, you know. So those students come from that situation into the first year at university, and especially for the boys, this was an extremely difficult thing. That I found much more challenging than dealing with the necessary disruption of the student protest movement.
So was the protest movement also the main reason why you resigned from your position, if you don't mind asking?
When I started the job in 2009, I said to my chair of council, who was sort of nominally my boss, I'm leaving after 7 years. because everywhere I've worked, you would have noticed I stayed for 7 years. In fact, I even wrote a book called Letters to My Children, which one of the letters says, if you stay in your job for longer than 7 years, you lack imagination. So 7 years was always the cutoff, regardless of what was happening. Yeah.
Do you think that becoming a university vice-chancellor is still viewed as a job that academic leaders would like to have?
That's a good question, and the answer is no. You know, most of us who were trained as vice-chancellor, as university leaders, were professors, you know, almost all of us. You're an expert in a discipline, and in a very small part of that discipline, you know something about how to build academic excellence and how to make teaching and research flourish in higher education. That's what we're really good at, or should be good at. And so we're not security managers, we are not firefighters, we are not counselors, you know, we are by and large academics. And I think what the protest movement and the student violence really did was to make a lot of us wonder, is this the job we want, you know, because you're not cut out for it, you know. And yeah, so in that sense, I think the job will increasingly become unattractive for people who are really outstanding in academicians. You know, it's stressful, it has an impact on your family, on your health. And so the downside is the people who might now apply might be people who don't understand what a university is about.
As a rector at the time, how did you understand the issue of decolonization of the universities, including their colonial curricula?
I don't think decolonization applies to our universities. I really don't. You know, I think it's a opportunistic term like radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital, all this nonsense, you know. And so people use decolonization. I say, where on earth does this come from? You know, our universities are not, you know, colonial, you know, bastions of colonial rule. They, if anything, they are remnants of the apartheid government of the past decades, you know. That's our more immediate problem. And I think it's a recklessness. That doesn't mean there aren't problems with culture, racism, you know, sexism, all of that stuff are real problems that reflect in our curriculum. There isn't enough of a presence of African literature, all of that is true. But to lob all of those problems as problems of colonization, and therefore you need to decolonize, I think people aren't thinking when they use these terms so recklessly.
Okay. What is the state of race relations at South Africa's universities, and how can the situation be improved?
One of the big mistakes we make is to expect the universities to be different from their communities. You know, so state of race relations in the country is really bad. You know, we're much better off, obviously, than in 1994. But we still have a long way to go, and so every now and again there'll be a really egregious racial incident in the newspapers somewhere, you know. And the universities are not ivory towers, they part and parcel. The students come from communities, you know, white and black. They come from broken societies. They come with, you know, these are 18-year-olds, these are not 5-year-olds. They come with really fixed views about women, about black people, about white people, about, you know, Indian people, and so on. So we mustn't fool ourselves to think that universities are somehow these wonderfully pure places, you know. Now, you do expect universities to be different in the sense that this is where you break down prejudice and bigotry and of all kinds, you know, and we should be leading the way. But it's really a journey. I mean, you can't, especially racism, or sexism, you can't switch it on and off like you switch a light. You've got to work at it day in and day out. You've got to have exemplars, people whose lives as leaders show us a different way. You've got to work on kids who come in after 18 years. You know, you've got a very fixed view of your past and yourself and your future. We've got to work on that, you know, and it's harder than people think. Having said that, again, certainly at the University of the Free State, we've had our fair share of drama, but I can tell you it's a very small minority compared to where we were in 2009. In fact, I've got a book coming out in November, which is about interracial love affairs and marriage and children. on the Free State campus, which when I got there, that was the last thing you'd witness, you know. So we've come a long way, but there's always a core of people who just don't understand our constitution and our democracy, and some will never change. I mean, you know, I've come to realize that you can change most people, but you'll always be at risk from a small minority who still think their parents are right and their future is dark.
That was Professor Jansen speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled As by Fire, The End of the South African University.